long before the word Germany even existed, before flags, borders, or national anthems. The land we now call Germany was a wild, untamed place. Imagine thick forests stretching endlessly, rivers winding through valleys, mist hanging over the trees in the early morning, and tiny settlements made of wooden huts scattered here and there. This was not a land of stone castles or grand cities yet. It was the land of the Germanic tribes. Groups of people who lived close to nature and shaped their lives around survival, family, and tradition. They weren't ruled by kings and crowns or emperors with armies of scribes. Instead, each tribe had its own leaders, often chosen for their strength in battle or their wisdom in guiding the people. Decisions weren't made in marble palaces, but around campfires and gatherings where warriors and elders spoke their minds. These tribes weren't unified under one flag. They didn't even think of themselves as one single people. To them, they were the Carusi, the Swabi, the Saxons, the Goths, the Vandals, and many more. Each tribe had its own way of life, its own gods, and its own pride. Yet together, they made up a culture that was strong, stubborn, and incredibly resilient. Life in these tribes was far from easy. The winters were long and harsh, the soil not always generous, and survival required hard work. Men were often farmers by day, warriors when needed. They tilled the fields, raised animals, and hunted in the dense woods. But when the call to defend their tribe came, they picked up their spears and shields without hesitation. Women had vital roles too, not just in raising children, but in managing households, and in some cases, even advising leaders. The people valued loyalty to their tribe above all else, and freedom was sacred. They didn't like the idea of being ruled by some distant power, and they certainly had no interest in bowing to foreign kings. Their independence was their identity, and they were ready to fight tooth and nail to protect it. The Germanic tribes were also deeply spiritual. They believed in gods connected to the natural world around them, deities of war, harvest, storms, and fate. These weren't the polished marble gods of Rome with temples and big cities. These were gods worshipped in sacred groves, in rituals that blended fear and respect for the forces of nature. Every sudden change in the wind was seen as a sign from the divine, and this belief made them both fearless and unpredictable in the eyes of outsiders. To them, death in battle wasn't something to fear, it was an honorable end, a ticket to join the gods in the afterlife. That mindset made them warriors that even mighty Rome had to think twice about. Now picture this. These wild tribes, living in their forests and villages, had a neighbor. Not just any neighbor, but the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen: Rome. Rome had roads, aqueducts, armies, laws, architecture that still amazes us today. It was rich, organized, disciplined, and it thought of itself as the center of civilization. To the Romans, anyone who didn't live like them was labeled a barbarian. And when they looked at the Germanic tribes, they saw exactly that: barbarians. People who didn't write books, who didn't build stone cities, who wore furs instead of togas. In the Roman eyes, the Germanic tribes were backward, uncivilized, and in desperate need of Roman order. But here's the funny thing. While the Romans looked down on the Germanic tribes, the tribes looked back at Rome with their own opinions. They saw the wealth, the luxury, the big cities, and thought, impressive, sure, but also weak. To the tribes, the Romans looked soft, spoiled by comfort, too used to laws and cities to survive in the wild. The Germanic people prided themselves on their toughness, their independence, their ability to endure hardship. So while Rome thought the tribes were beneath them, the tribes thought Rome wasn't nearly as strong as it claimed to be. And that tension, one side arrogant in its civilization, the other fierce in its freedom, created a relationship that was destined to explode. The contact between the Romans and the Germanic tribes started mostly through trade and skirmishes along the borders. Roman merchants wanted furs, amber, and slaves, while the tribes wanted Roman wine, weapons, and sometimes gold. But trade was never enough to cover the deeper issue. Rome wanted to expand. And the Germanic tribes had no intention of letting anyone conquer their forests. To Rome, expanding north into Germania seemed like the next step. To the tribes, it felt like an invasion of their sacred homeland. And so, conflict became inevitable. One of the most famous examples of this conflict came in the early years of the 1st century. When the Roman legions marched deep into Germanic territory, they thought their discipline, armor, and advanced tactics would guarantee victory. After all, Rome had conquered much of Europe, North Africa, and even parts of Asia. How hard could a few barbarians in the woods be? But the Romans underestimated their enemy. The Germanic warriors knew their land like the back of their hands. They used the forests, the rivers, and the terrain itself as weapons. They didn't fight in straight lines like the Roman legions. They fought in ambushes, in sudden attacks, in brutal, close combat. They were willing to endure losses, if it meant defending their freedom. For the tribes, it wasn't about glory or expanding an empire, it was survival. The clash of these two worlds set the tone for centuries. On one side, the structured, disciplined, arrogant Rome. On the other, the wild, independent, stubborn Germanic tribes. It was like watching two completely different philosophies of life slam into each other. And while Rome had its roads, its generals, and its mighty legions, the Germanic tribes had something Rome never truly understood: an unbreakable attachment to their land and their freedom that made them impossible to fully conquer. Even today, when we think back to this time, it's easy to imagine the atmosphere. The misty forests, the sound of horns calling warriors to gather, the sight of men and women standing proudly in front of their wooden halls, ready to fight off anyone who dared to control them. It wasn't a world of castles and knights yet. It was a raw, primal time when tribes carved out their identity not through written history, but through stories passed down by firelight, by courage in battle, and by an unshakable will to remain free. And this spirit, this defiance, would echo through the centuries of German history to come. If the Germanic tribes were the wild neighbors in the forest, then Rome was the gigantic empire with marble walls. Armies marching in perfect lines, and an attitude that screamed, "We're the center of the world." The relationship between Rome and the Germanic tribes wasn't simple. It wasn't just war all the time, but it definitely wasn't peace either. Think of it like one of those relationships where two people can't stand each other, but also can't fully stay away. There was trade, there were alliances, but there was also betrayal, raids, and battles that would shake both sides for generations. At first, Rome thought it could handle the Germanic tribes the way it had handled so many others before. The Romans had conquered Gaul, which is basically modern-day France. They thought pushing a little further east into Germania would be no problem. The legions were powerful, disciplined, and battle-hardened. To a Roman general, the tribes looked disorganized and primitive. How could a bunch of farmers and hunters stand against the might of Rome? But the Germanic tribes had an advantage that the Romans didn't appreciate enough. They knew their land, and they were patient. One of the earliest and most shocking lessons Rome learned came in the year 09 CE, deep in the Teutoburg forest. The Roman general Varus led 3 legions into Germanic territory, expecting a routine march. The Germanic leader Arminius, who had actually served with the Roman army before, tricked the Romans into believing everything was safe. But as the soldiers marched through the thick, muddy forest, rain pouring down and visibility low, the Germans struck. They knew the paths, they knew where to hide, and they attacked with a fury Rome had underestimated. For days, the Romans were ambushed and slaughtered. When it was over, Rome had lost around 20,000 men. 3 legions were completely wiped out. The Roman eagle's standard symbols of their pride and power were captured. It was a humiliation that scarred Rome for generations. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was more than just a military loss. It was a turning point. After that, Rome realized that fully conquering Germania might not be possible. The tribes weren't going to fold like others had. The Romans built fortifications along the Rhine River, drawing a sort of invisible line between their world and the world of the Germanic tribes. They called the area beyond it Barbaricum, the land of the barbarians. To the Romans, it was dangerous, unpredictable, and not worth the endless blood and treasure it would take to conquer. So instead of total conquest, Rome settled into a love-hate relationship with the tribes. Sometimes the two sides traded. Roman merchants would bring wine, glass, and luxury goods into the forests, while Germanic tribes sold furs, amber, and even slaves. This trade created a strange kind of respect. Germanic warriors loved Roman weapons and armor, while Romans sometimes admired the raw toughness of the Germans. But trade was never enough to erase the tension. Raids across the border were common, and when Rome was weak, the tribes didn't hesitate to take advantage. Ironically, Rome also began to recruit Germanic warriors into its own army. The empire was huge, and maintaining it required soldiers from everywhere. Romans realized that if you couldn't beat the Germans, maybe it was smarter to pay them. Germanic fighters became part of the Roman legions, serving as auxiliaries. They fought bravely, but their loyalty was often more to gold and opportunity than to Rome itself. And that would come back to haunt the empire later. As centuries passed, the balance of power slowly shifted. Rome was mighty, yes, but it wasn't invincible. Internal problems, corruption, political chaos, economic troubles began to weaken the empire. And whenever cracks appeared, the Germanic tribes were there to push harder. Tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks began moving closer to Roman lands. Sometimes they came as refugees, fleeing from even harsher enemies like the Huns. Sometimes they came as invaders, raiding and settling on Roman soil. The empire, once confident in its eternal strength, found itself struggling to keep these so-called barbarians out. One dramatic moment came in the year 410, when the Visigoths, led by Alaric, actually sacked Rome itself. Imagine that Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the empire, looted by people it once called barbarians. The shock across the Roman world was enormous. The tribes that Rome had looked down on for centuries were now inside the gates, taking whatever they wanted. And this was only the beginning. Over the following decades, different Germanic tribes carved out pieces of the Roman world for themselves. The Vandals took North Africa, the Visigoths settled in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Franks eventually established themselves in Gaul. For the Roman people, this was the nightmare come true. The empire they thought would last forever was being eaten alive by tribes they once dismissed as savages. But for the Germanic tribes, this was an opportunity. They weren't just raiders anymore. We're founders of new kingdoms, shaping the future of Europe on the ruins of Rome. It's almost funny when you think about it. Rome had labeled them barbarians, people outside civilization. But when Rome collapsed, it was those very same people who picked up the pieces and built the foundations of medieval Europe. The so-called barbarians became kings, rulers, and founders of dynasties. The Germanic spirit of independence, toughness, and loyalty to tribe didn't disappear, just evolved into new forms of leadership and society. Still, during those long centuries before the fall of Rome, the relationship between the Romans and the Germanic tribes remained a mix of trade, fear, admiration, and bloodshed. Rome couldn't conquer them, but it also couldn't ignore them. The tribes couldn't defeat Rome in a single blow, but over time, their persistence wore the empire down. It was like a constant pressure on the edges of the Roman world, a reminder that civilization's walls weren't as unbreakable as they seemed. And if you close your eyes and picture it, you can almost hear the clash of two worlds. On one side, the steady march of Roman legions, shields locked, banners raised, orders shouted in Latin. On the other, the wild cries of Germanic warriors charging from the forests, spears flying, their freedom on the line. Two different worlds, two different ways of life, colliding again and again. And though Rome seemed unstoppable at first, history would prove that even the mightiest empire can stumble when faced with a people who refuse to be broken. This complicated dance between Rome and the Germanic tribes set the stage for the next era of history. Because once Rome was gone, it was the Germans who stepped into the vacuum, shaping what would become the heart of Europe for centuries to come. When Rome finally collapsed under the weight of its own problems and the relentless pressure of the tribes, the map of Europe looked very different. Out of the ruins, new kingdoms began to rise, and many of those kingdoms were built by the same Germanic tribes that had once lived in forests and villages. They were no longer just the outsiders at the edge of civilization. Now they were kings, rulers, and founders of nations. But their story didn't stop there, because out of this shifting landscape, something new began to take shape in the heart of Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. And the Germans were right at the center of it. The Holy Roman Empire was a strange creation. Imagine trying to glue together dozens, even hundreds of different lands, each with its own leaders, traditions, and ambitions, and then calling the result an empire. That's more or less what happened. It was called holy because it was closely tied to the Catholic Church. It was called Roman because people wanted to link themselves to the glory of the old Roman Empire, even though Rome itself was long gone. and it was called an empire because it sounded powerful, but in reality, it was more of a patchwork quilt than a single unified country. At the center of this empire were the Germans, and it was German kings and nobles who often wore the crown of emperor. One of the first and most famous rulers connected to this empire was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was not just a king of the Franks, but also someone with a vision of uniting Europe under both political power and Christianity. Around the year 800, he was crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope in Rome. And for a moment it felt like the idea of Rome had been reborn, this time with a Germanic ruler at its head. Charlemagne built schools, supported learning, strengthened the church, and expanded his territory through war and diplomacy. Under his rule, Europe saw a kind of revival that historians later called the Carolingian Renaissance. For the German people, it was proof that they could be more than just tribes or kingdoms. They could stand at the heart of an empire that mattered. But here's the catch. When Charlemagne died, his empire didn't hold together the way he might have hoped. It split up among his descendants, and eventually, the German lands became the core of what would be called the Holy Roman Empire. The Germans had the emperors, but holding everything together was another story. The empire stretched from modern-day Germany into parts of Italy, Austria, Switzerland, and beyond. But instead of being a strong, centralized state, it was more like a loose alliance of many princes, dukes, bishops, and city-states, all with their own interests. For the German people, this meant living in a land that was powerful in name, but divided in practice. On paper, the emperor was the highest authority. In reality, his power often depended on the cooperation of local rulers who guarded their independence fiercely. The system allowed for German influence across Europe, but it also created constant tension. Who was really in charge? The emperor in his grand court, or the duke in his fortified castle? Religion also played a huge role in this empire, and the Germans were deeply tied to it. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a political player with immense wealth and influence. Bishops controlled lands and armies, and the Pope in Rome often clashed with emperors over who had the final say in ruling. This struggle came to a head in events like the famous Walk to Canossa in 1077, when the German Emperor Henry IV had to humble himself before the Pope after a bitter conflict over the right to appoint bishops. Imagine the most powerful man in Germany standing barefoot in the snow, begging for forgiveness. That's how complicated the balance of power was. Despite all this messiness, the German role in the Holy Roman Empire was massive. They provided the emperors, the armies, and much of the culture that defined the empire. German cities like Cologne, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt became centers of trade and learning. German knights rode in crusades, German scholars studied ancient texts, and German artisans built cathedrals that still stand today. The people were no longer just tribes in the woods, they were a central force in shaping medieval Europe. Still, the nature of the empire created problems that would never fully go away. Unlike France or England, which were slowly becoming unified kingdoms, the German lands remained fragmented. One emperor might try to assert control, but the local princes would push back. Over time, this meant that Germany developed more like a collection of many small states, rather than one strong nation. And while this diversity brought cultural richness, it also planted the seeds of division that would shape the future. If you lived in the empire at this time, you might not have even thought of yourself as German. Instead, your loyalty was probably to your local lord, your city, or your region. You were a Saxon, a Bavarian, a Swabian, or a Franconian before you were anything else. The idea of a single German nation was still far, far away. And yet, in their role as the backbone of the Holy Roman Empire, the German people were laying the foundations of something bigger. What's fascinating is how this messy, complicated empire could last for so long. Despite its constant divisions and conflicts, the Holy Roman Empire endured for centuries. Emperors came and went, wars were fought, borders shifted, but the structure held together in one form or another all the way until the 19th century. And through it all, the Germans were both proud participants and frustrated subjects. They had the glory of being at the heart of a grand empire, but they also carried the burden of living in a land where unity was always just out of reach. Looking back, it almost feels like a contradiction. The Germans were powerful enough to supply emperors and armies, influential enough to shape European politics, but too divided to ever truly bring all their lands under one clear rule. was a mix of pride and frustration, strength and weakness. And in a way, that paradox defined their place in history for a very long time. So, from the wild tribes that once terrified Rome, the Germans had become central figures in a new empire. They were no longer just outsiders banging on the gates of civilization. They were the ones wearing crowns, leading armies, and shaping the destiny of Europe. But their story was far from simple, and the divisions that ran through their lands would set the stage for the next chapter in their history. One marked by feudal lords, rival princes, and endless struggles for power. By the time the Middle Ages rolled on, the German lands were right in the middle of something both fascinating and frustrating at the same time. A land of incredible richness, but one that was constantly divided. Instead of becoming one solid kingdom like France or England, Germany turned into a patchwork of smaller states, each with its own ruler, its own pride, and sometimes even its own army and coinage. It was as if someone had taken a big piece of land, smashed it into hundreds of tiny puzzle pieces, and then said, "Good luck running this." That was the reality of feudal politics in Germany. It shaped the country's history for centuries. At the heart of this problem was the feudal system. On paper, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was supposed to be the top authority, but in practice, things were very different. The emperor depended on powerful dukes, counts, bishops, and even free cities to support him. These local rulers weren't just loyal subjects. They acted like little kings in their own territories. They collected their own taxes, built their own castles, and made their own alliances. Some even went to war with each other while technically still being part of the same empire. It was like a family where everyone insists they're in charge, and every dinner turns into an argument. If you were an ordinary person living in medieval Germany, this division would be something you felt in daily life. Imagine traveling just 50 miles and suddenly finding yourself in a completely different territory where the ruler demanded different taxes, the local dialect sounded strange, and the laws didn't quite match the ones back home. One day, you might be in the lands of a duke, the next in the lands of a bishop, and later in a free city run by wealthy merchants. Each stop might bring new tolls, new rules, and new headaches. For merchants, this was a nightmare. But it also made certain cities and regions thrive as centers of trade because they found clever ways to take advantage of the situation. Castles popped up across the land, not only as homes for nobles but also as symbols of power and control. Each noble wanted to show strength, and castles gave them both defense and prestige. From these strongholds, local rulers could demand loyalty from peasants and enforce their authority. But the sheer number of these castles was also a sign of how fragmented Germany was. Instead of one strong central government, you had hundreds of smaller powers all competing for influence. Religion added another layer of complexity. Catholic Church wasn't just about faith, it was a massive landowner and political player. Bishops and abbots ruled over territories just like secular lords did. And they owed allegiance not only to the emperor, but also to the Pope in Rome. Sometimes this created bizarre situations where church leaders acted more like princes than priests, marching into battle with their own soldiers and making deals with nobles. For the ordinary villager, this meant that whether you paid taxes to a bishop or a duke, life could feel pretty much the same. You worked the land, you gave up part of your harvest, and you hoped your lord protected you from bandits or rival armies. Despite the chaos, Germany wasn't just stuck in endless conflict. Fragmentation also created opportunities. Many free cities like Lübeck, Nuremberg, and Hamburg grew powerful through trade and commerce. They didn't rely on kings or emperors, they relied on merchants, guilds, and trade networks that stretched across Europe. The famous Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of trading cities, emerged from this environment, turning German merchants into some of the wealthiest and most influential players in Europe. These cities showed that even in a divided land, prosperity could bloom. Still, the rivalry between local rulers and the emperor never disappeared. Some emperors tried to centralize power and bring unity, but they often failed. Whenever one ruler grew too strong, the others would band together to cut him down. It was a constant balancing act, a tug-of-war between the dream of unity and the reality of independence. And while France and England slowly developed stronger national identities, Germany remained a land of many voices, each one proud of its own heritage and suspicious of being controlled by someone else. This deep fragmentation shaped the German character in unique ways. Loyalty to family, clan, or region was often stronger than loyalty to the idea of a nation. People were proud to be Bavarian, Saxon, or Swabian long before they thought of themselves as German. Local traditions, dialects, and laws thrived, giving the land incredible cultural richness, but also making it difficult to ever act as one united force. That sense of division, born in the age of feudalism, would echo for centuries, influencing everything from politics to identity. And yet, there was a kind of strength hidden within the chaos. The German lands became centers of art, architecture, philosophy, and music. Monasteries preserved ancient knowledge, universities began to emerge. Craftsmen built cathedrals that reached for the heavens. The competition between cities and regions sometimes sparked innovation, as each wanted to outshine the other. Division may have weakened political unity, but it also created a fertile ground for culture and ideas. For the people living in that time, though, it was less about culture and more about survival. Peasants worked the land, bound by obligations to their lords. Knights swore loyalty in exchange for land and privileges. Nobles plotted marriages and alliances to expand their influence. The emperor, meanwhile, often traveled across his vast empire, trying to keep the peace and remind everyone who was supposed to be in charge. But in truth, no emperor could ever fully control all of Germany. It was simply too fractured, too full of strong-willed rulers who valued their independence above all else. The irony of all this is that Germany had the potential to be one of the strongest nations in Europe. It had rich lands, hardworking people, strategic cities, and deep traditions. But because of feudal politics and endless fragmentation, it never quite pulled together as a single power. Instead, it remained a place where unity was always just out of reach, a dream chased but never caught. As the centuries went on, this reality shaped the path Germany would follow. While other nations consolidated and grew stronger, Germany's divisions left it vulnerable to outside influence, eternal conflict, and endless rivalries. And yet those very divisions also preserved its unique diversity and local identities. It was a land full of contradictions, powerful but weak, rich but divided, proud but fractured. Looking back, it's almost easy to see why German unification would take so long to finally happen. The habits of division, the independence of local rulers, and the weight of centuries of feudal politics created patterns that were incredibly difficult to break. But all of this history, all of this chaos, was not wasted. It was laying the groundwork for the struggles, revolutions, and ambitions that would one day push Germany toward unity. For now, though, in the medieval age, it remained a place of castles on every hill, toll booths on every road, and rulers who were kings of their own little worlds. And so, the story of Germany, before it became a single nation, was not one of simple beginnings. It was the story of tribes, of empires, of endless divisions, and of people who valued their independence fiercely. From the wild forests of the Germanic tribes to the patchwork of feudal states, the path was long, complicated, and messy. But without that messy beginning, the later story of Germany's rise would never have been possible.